They always say blood is thicker than water, but nobody tells you that same blood can drown you. For 28 years, I suffocated in a flawless shadow forged by my sister's lies. The night my parents casually dropped $150,000 to officially brand me a failure, they had no idea they were handing me my ticket to freedom. Listen closely, because the truth about so-called winners hides an ending nobody could ever predict. Hello to all our wonderful listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with no budget to keep operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to sustain their livelihoods and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments of this video. Thank you so much for your support. My name is Neve Pierce, and this is the night my life truly began. The crystal chandeliers of my parents' sprawling suburban Chicago mansion cast a harsh, unforgiving glare over the long mahogany dining table. I sat wedged between a venture capitalist who smelled heavily of expensive gin and a marketing executive who had not glanced my way a single time all evening. I am 28 years old, employed as an urban agricultural engineer for the prestigious Verdant Horizon Innovations, but in this room, I was entirely invisible. Tonight was an altar built solely to worship my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe held court at the head of the table, bathed in the warm, golden glow of my parents' unfiltered adoration. She was celebrating the official launch of her new lifestyle technology app, a flashy, superficial platform promising aesthetic perfection to people who had far too much money and far too little substance. To my parents, Arthur and Diane, she was nothing short of a startup genius. Their eyes tracked her every movement with a beaming pride that bordered on fanaticism. It was the exact kind of pride I had spent my entire existence desperately trying to earn with dirt under my fingernails. Sleepless nights in laboratories and academic degrees hanging quietly on my apartment wall. The sharp clinking of crystal wine glasses suddenly signaled a toast, cutting through the low hum of wealthy chatter. My father, Arthur, stood up, slowly smoothing the lapels of his custom-tailored charcoal suit. The dining room fell into a reverent, expectant hush. He reached deliberately into his breast pocket and produced a crisp, carefully folded piece of paper. "To Chloe," he announced, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man who always got his way. "Your mother and I are incredibly proud of the magnificent empire you are building from the ground up. To ensure your brilliant vision reaches its absolute full potential, we have decided to withdraw a significant portion of our retirement fund to back you." He paused, a master of theatrical timing, holding the slip of paper up to catch the light of the chandelier. $150,000. This is a worthy investment for the family's only winner. A chorus of polite, wealthy applause erupted around the room. Chloe shrieked in manufactured delight, leaping from her chair to rush over and throw her arms around him. I sat frozen, staring blankly at my plate. The roasted duck suddenly looked like dry ash. The words "only winner" echoed relentlessly in my head, sharp, jagged, and designed to cut deep. The vast dining room suddenly felt impossibly tight, the oxygen thinning with every breath I took. Before I could stop myself, the heavy, exhausting desperation I had been swallowing down all week clawed its way up my throat. As the applause finally died down and the guests returned to their expensive wine, my voice, fragile but desperate for just a sliver of that familial warmth, broke the silence. "I actually had some news about my work today, too," I said. The guests turned to look at me, their expressions mildly annoyed by the sudden interruption of the celebratory mood. My mother's perfectly painted smile tightened into a thin, white line. "The board of directors at Verdant Horizon reviewed my proposal for the new ecological greenhouse project," I continued, swallowing hard and looking directly into my father's eyes, begging for a shred of empathy. "They rejected my funding request this afternoon. It was only $10,000. I just feel so completely drained, and I was really hoping maybe you guys could tell me it is going to be okay. I was not asking for their money. I did not want a check. I did not want a grand gesture. I simply wanted a tiny fraction of the blind belief they poured so effortlessly into Chloe. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence descended on the opulent room. Then, Arthur let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was not a chuckle of sympathy. It was a loud, aggressive, mocking sound that violently ripped through the polite atmosphere. $10,000? My father sneered, his face flushing with genuine incredulity and disgust. And they still turned you down? Navaya, when are you going to wake up from this delusion? You are a failed dreamer playing in the dirt like a child. Look at your sister. She is building $1 million empire, securing real capital, creating something that actually matters to the world. Meanwhile, you are sitting here crying over a few weeds and a rejection letter for absolute pennies. Your years of so-called scientific dedication are practically garbage in the real world. Why should any rational person invest in a sinking ship? The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging sideways glances, but not a single person intervened. My mother simply took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine, her total silence acting as an absolute, crushing endorsement of his cruelty. Chloe looked across the table at me with a sickening mixture of performative pity and deep, triumphant smugness. I sat perfectly still. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar burning sting behind my eyes, the crushing, familiar weight of heartbreak that had completely defined my relationship with these people for 28 years. But nothing came. Not a single tear fell. Instead, an absolute, profound, freezing stillness washed over my mind. It was as if a heavy, suffocating blanket had suddenly been lifted. The chaotic, pathetic noise of my lifelong yearning for their approval simply switched off like a broken television. The air in my lungs finally felt cold, sharp, and incredibly clear. I calmly picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it meticulously into a perfect, crisp square, and placed it gently on the mahogany table beside my untouched plate. I pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor, a harsh, final punctuation mark to the evening. I stood up, straightening my spine, and looked directly into my father's cold eyes. My voice did not shake. It was entirely devoid of emotion. "You are absolutely right," I said quietly, the words dropping like heavy stones into the dead silent room. "You will never have to invest in a failure ever again." I turned my back on the gleaming crystal, the expensive wine, the $150,000 check, and the people who shared my blood. I walked steadily out of the dining room, down the grand, echoing hallway, and stepped out through the heavy oak front doors into the freezing, black Chicago night, leaving them behind forever. Exactly 21 days after I walked out of that dining room, my entire professional world collapsed. It happened with a terrifying suddenness. On a random Tuesday morning, I arrived at Verdant Horizon Innovations to find federal agents swarming the glass-paneled lobby. The board of directors, the same people who had rejected my modest funding request, had been hiding massive financial fraud for years. By noon, the company officially declared bankruptcy. My job was gone. My health insurance was gone. Worse still, the corporate matched retirement account I had been diligently paying into since my first day was completely wiped out in the fallout. I was escorted out of the building holding a single cardboard box containing a coffee mug and a few notebooks. The silence of my cramped Chicago apartment was deafening. I had exactly $3,412 left to my name. My father's cruel voice echoed in my head, calling me a sinking ship. But at the absolute bottom of my despair, late one night while scrolling blindly through online property listings, a strange advertisement caught my eye. It was for a severely alkaline, completely barren plot of land out in the Sedona, Arizona desert. The soil was supposedly toxic, the water table was a nightmare, and the seller was practically giving it away for the price of a used car. A rational person would have closed the laptop. But I was done being rational in a world that rewarded fakes like my sister. I looked at that photograph of cracked, dead red earth and saw a blank canvas. Within 48 hours, I sold everything I owned. My winter coats, my television, my bed frame, and my books all went to pawn shops and online buyers. I bought a battered, faded blue pickup truck, loaded my tools and a few boxes of belongings into the back, and drove out of Chicago without looking in the rearview mirror. The 2,000-mile journey across the country was a slow shedding of my past. As the gray skyscrapers faded into sprawling plains, and the plains cracked open into the jagged, towering red rock canyons of Arizona, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried my whole life began to shift into something wilder. Arriving at the plot, the reality of my choice hit me like a physical blow. The land was a graveyard of dry brush and rocks, baked by a sun that routinely pushed past 100 degrees. My new home was a rusted, dented travel trailer left behind by the previous owner, smelling of dust and old mice. Those first few months were a brutal, unforgiving war for survival. I woke up before dawn every single day, swinging a heavy iron pickaxe into earth that felt like solid concrete. My hands blistered, bled, and turned entirely to calluses. I spent my evenings in the suffocating heat of the metal trailer, testing soil acidity levels under a flickering battery-powered lantern, failing to crossbreed drought-resistant seeds over and over again in absolute crushing isolation. I needed water, and the fragile local supply was highly regulated. That was how I met Julian. I walked into the local county water resource research station covered in a thick layer of red dust, holding a stack of hand-drawn blueprints. Julian was standing behind the counter. He was an irrigation specialist, a quiet, weathered man with rough hands and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not offer a polite customer service smile. He just stared at the complex, deeply unconventional diagrams I spread out on the counter. "You are trying to grow high-yield crops on the deadest patch of alkali rock in this county," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The evaporation rate alone will kill everything within 48 hours. Not if the irrigation is entirely subterranean and self-contained," I replied, pointing a dirt-stained finger at my schematics. "If I can build a closed-loop system using capillary action, the surface heat will not matter. But I need the initial municipal permit to run the baseline pipes." Julian leaned in closer, studying the math I had scribbled in the margins. I braced myself for the rejection, for the mocking laugh I had heard so many times back in Illinois. Instead, he looked up at me. There was no pity in his face. There was only a sharp, intense recognition. He was the very first person in my entire life who looked at my impossible ideas and actually saw the vision. "Your pressure calculations are slightly off on the eastern slope," he said quietly. "I get off shift at 6. I will bring my survey gear." From that evening on, the isolation broke. Julian and I spent countless sleepless nights under the sprawling canopy of desert stars. We dug trenches side by side until our muscles screamed, laying down miles of thin, flexible tubing to create the underground circulatory system my plants desperately needed. He brought a quiet, grounded strength to my frantic, driven energy. When the final pipe was sealed and the water began to flow silently beneath the harsh earth, we knelt together in the dirt. With trembling hands, I placed the very first resilient, genetically modified seeds into the damp red sand. We sat there in the dark, breathing in the scent of wet earth, waiting for the desert to finally wake up. 2 years passed. 730 days of relentless, unforgiving sun, and an equal number of freezing, silent desert nights. But the earth, once a hostile graveyard of cracked rocks, finally surrendered to our persistence. It did not just yield, it exploded into life. We named it the Amber Oasis, where toxic dust used to swirl, rows upon rows of lush, vibrant greenery now stretched out, catching the golden hour light in a breathtaking tapestry of life. The oasis was no longer a desperate experiment. It was a thriving ecological sanctuary and a highly specialized conservatory for rare medicinal botanicals. Underneath the custom-built shade structures, we cultivated delicate, drought-resistant herbs and deeply potent aloe varieties that were impossible to grow anywhere else. Within 18 months, our yield was so pure and concentrated that the absolute biggest names in American cosmeceuticals were actively bidding against each other for exclusive supply contracts. The failed dreamer, as my father so eloquently branded me, was now the sole proprietor of a wildly lucrative, entirely self-sustaining enterprise. Prestigious landscape architecture and agricultural technology magazines began publishing glowing feature articles about the miraculous farm in the middle of nowhere. They called the creator a visionary, an absolute pioneer in arid climate cultivation. Yet not a single one of those glossy pages featured my face. I demanded strict anonymity in every contract I signed. I maintained absolutely zero social media presence. There were no flashy launch parties, no self-congratulatory posts, no desperate attempts to prove my worth to a world that thrived on digital validation. I was a ghost who grew miracles in the sand, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The only person who truly knew me, the only person who saw the bruised, exhausted woman behind the thriving business, was Julian. Our partnership, born from irrigation blueprints and calloused hands, had quietly and organically blossomed into a profound, fiercely protective love. We did not need grand, poetic declarations or expensive dinners to validate our bond. Our romance was written in the quiet rhythm of our daily labor. It was found in the way he would silently hand me a canteen of cold water when the afternoon heat peaked past 100 degrees. It was in the shared, bone-deep exhaustion we felt as we sat side by side on the porch at dusk, covered in sweat and red dirt, watching the sunset paint the canyons in brilliant shades of violet and burnt orange. We were deeply rooted in the earth and in each other. Through every new green shoot that stubbornly pushed its way through the soil, I slowly realized I was completely rebuilding myself. The haunting, suffocating desperation for my parents' approval, the agonizing pain of being discarded for my sister's illusions, it all simply evaporated into the thin desert air. I no longer needed their manufactured applause. The earth had given me the only validation that actually mattered. It proved that if you tend to something with genuine care and relentless dedication, it will grow. Because of the undeniable success of the farm, corporate vultures inevitably started circling. Late one Tuesday afternoon, representatives from a massive global luxury resort conglomerate drove up our long gravel driveway in heavily tinted black SUVs. They sat in my modest farmhouse living room and placed a formal, legally binding offer on the table. They wanted to buy the Amber Oasis outright to turn it into an exclusive eco-resort for the ultra-rich. They offered me multiple millions of dollars, enough money to never work another day in my life. I looked at the impossibly high number printed on the crisp white paper, then looked out the window at the rows of vibrant botanicals Julian and I had coaxed from the dead soil. "The offer is extremely generous," I told the lead executive, sliding the folder back across the table without a second thought. "But this land is not a financial asset to me. It is my soul. It is my salvation. And neither of those things are for sale at any price." I sent them packing before the sun went down. However, the corporate world was not quite done with me. Less than 48 hours after I rejected the buyout, my encrypted business email pinged with a highly unusual request. A private concierge service, operating on behalf of an anonymous VIP client from a prominent Chicago-based investment fund, was urgently seeking to book the entire guest wing of the farm. They were not looking to buy the land. They wanted to rent it for a long, deeply private, and entirely secluded healing retreat. They offered to pay an exorbitant sum, wiring a 50% non-refundable deposit up front without a single negotiation, demanding absolute discretion and zero contact with the outside world. The word Chicago sent a brief, icy chill down my spine, a ghost from a past life I thought I had buried beneath the desert sand. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the mouse. But the pragmatist in me, the woman who had built an empire from $3,000, recognized the undeniable financial influx this would bring for our next expansion phase. I confirmed the reservation, entirely unaware that the ghosts of my past were already packing their bags to haunt my sanctuary. Just 48 hours before our highly anticipated VIP guests were scheduled to arrive, the carefully constructed, bulletproof facade of my family's perfect life violently shattered across national television. I was deep inside the main botanical greenhouse, carefully wiping damp soil from my hands, when Julian suddenly turned up the volume on the small, battery-powered radio we kept on the workbench. The news broadcaster's voice was sharp, urgent, and filled with a grim satisfaction. A massive, coordinated federal raid had just dismantled a highly sophisticated, multi-million-dollar pyramid scheme that had been masquerading as a revolutionary lifestyle technology app. The arrogant founder's assets were completely frozen by the government, and she was currently sitting in federal custody, facing dozens of counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. These charges carried a maximum sentence of up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The face plastered across every major news network was Chloe. It turned out her glittering, highly praised tech empire was nothing but an elaborate digital shell game. She had been aggressively taking millions of dollars from desperate new investors purely to pay off the wealthy early ones, selling a completely fabricated illusion of wellness while quietly funneling the massive capital into untraceable offshore shell companies. The revered startup genius of the family was a profound, calculating fraud. The subsequent investigative reports over the next 24 hours painted a pathetic, horrifying picture of the collateral damage she left in her wake. My parents, Arthur and Diane, blinded by their absolute worship of their golden child, had thrown themselves directly onto the sword for her. When the initial civil lawsuits began to hit, long before the federal indictments were even unsealed, they had frantically tried to quietly pay off the loudest victims to protect Chloe's pristine reputation. Driven by the toxic, sunk-cost fallacy of their own parenting, they took out a massive second mortgage on the sprawling Chicago mansion. They liquidated every single penny of their remaining retirement funds. They sold the luxury cars, my mother's diamond jewelry, and the expensive art collections. They bled themselves completely dry to save their one and only winner. It was an entirely useless sacrifice. The sheer scale of Chloe's financial theft was far too massive for them to cover. Now they were left utterly penniless, facing imminent foreclosure on a house they no longer owned, and completely ostracized by the wealthy, superficial social circles they had desperately clawed their way into for decades. The high society friends who had clapped so politely at that dinner table 2 years ago had instantly turned their backs, treating my parents like absolute pariahs. I did not have the necessary time to fully process the bitter cinematic irony of their sudden downfall because the fleet of heavy black SUVs was already rolling up my gravel driveway. I stood deliberately out of sight, watching from the shadowy, elevated loft of the main supply barn as the VIP guests stepped out into the blinding, unforgiving Arizona sun. They looked significantly older, terribly haggard, and profoundly paranoid. They jumped nervously at the simple sound of a desert hawk crying in the distance. As the lead guest hastily removed his expensive sunglasses to wipe the nervous sweat from his forehead, my breath completely caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew that face. I knew every single one of their faces. It was the former chief executive officer and the core executive board of Verdant Horizon Innovations. These were the exact same arrogant, untouchable men who had casually signed the bankruptcy papers, gutted my entire agricultural department, destroyed my hard-earned pension, and thrown me out onto the street with a cardboard box 2 years ago. They were currently hiding. They had booked my isolated, anonymous farm under a complicated dummy corporation to escape the relentless media scrutiny and the incoming legal subpoenas regarding their own unresolved, highly publicized financial crimes. That night, a heavy, suffocating tension settled over the farm like a thick blanket. The air felt charged, practically vibrating with their paranoia. I told Julian to stay back in our private cabin while I conducted a routine perimeter check near the guest wing. The desert air was perfectly still, capable of carrying sound for miles through the darkness. As I walked silently past the open, screenless windows of their rented lodge, I heard the nervous clinking of ice against heavy crystal glasses and the low, panicked voices of desperate men aggressively turning on each other. I pressed my spine against the cool adobe wall, holding my breath, and listened intently to the shadows. They were arguing bitterly about a phantom investment group, a massive shadow entity that had orchestrated the intentional, calculated collapse of Verdant Horizon. They had deliberately tanked their own company, illegally stripping its profitable assets and pensions to quietly feed this massive shadow fund. It was a textbook corporate bust-out scheme. But then, the former chief financial officer practically screamed a name that made the blood in my veins run entirely cold. He explicitly mentioned Chloe's startup. "We funneled the Verdant liquidation money right into her app's seed rounds, exactly like the shadow fund demanded," the man hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw rage and sheer terror. "We used that arrogant little girl's fake wellness company as a pristine, high-tech washing machine for the corporate embezzlement, and now the feds are tearing her apart piece by piece. If the government accountants trace her initial fraudulent capital back to our accounts, we are all going to die in a federal prison cell." I slowly slid down the rough adobe wall, my knees hitting the soft dirt as the horrific, deeply twisted reality completely locked into place inside my mind. The puzzle pieces fit together with a sickening crunch. The wealthy board members of Verdant Horizon had intentionally stolen my job, my years of scientific research, and my financial security to generate dirty capital. That exact same dirty capital was then aggressively funneled straight into Chloe's startup to be washed clean under the guise of venture capitalism. And the absolute most agonizing, soul-crushing truth of all? That crisp, folded check my father had so proudly waved in the air at that dinner party, the exact $150,000 he gleefully handed to Chloe to officially brand me a pathetic failure, was quite literally funded by the very entity that had intentionally destroyed my life. The money that elevated her was the exact same money that had bankrupted me. My parents had not just been horribly biased or casually cruel. In their blind, arrogant desperation to elevate Chloe to the status of a god, they had unknowingly taken a direct cut of the stolen money built entirely on the ashes of my destroyed career. They had essentially used my blood, my sweat, and my stolen future to build a delusional, glittering pedestal for their favorite, fraudulent child. I sat there in the pitch-black desert night, the profound silence of the canyon ringing loudly in my ears. I realized then that karmic justice had not just gently knocked on my family's front door. It had violently kicked it down, poured gasoline on their perfect illusion, and set the entire house ablaze. The silence of the desert is absolute, but desperation always finds a way to track you down. Through their frantic web of unpaid, high-priced defense attorneys, Arthur and Diane managed to trace the anonymous shell companies of Amber Oasis directly back to me. Just 3 days after I uncovered the horrifying truth about the Verdant Horizon executives, a cheap, dented rental car sputtered up my pristine gravel driveway. I stood on the shaded wraparound porch of the main farmhouse, watching as the heavy metal doors of the pathetic vehicle groaned open. The two people who stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun were entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, wealthy socialites who had laughed me out of their Chicago mansion. Arthur's custom-tailored suits were gone, replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack polo shirt that hung loosely from his shrinking frame. Diane looked frail, her perfectly styled hair now graying and brittle, her designer makeup washed away by weeks of unrelenting public humiliation and sheer, exhausting panic. They stood completely frozen at the edge of the property, their tired eyes wide as they took in the sheer scale of the estate. They stared blankly at the massive, climate-controlled glass domes, the endless rows of thriving, vibrant botanicals, and the state-of-the-art solar arrays. The absolute shock on their faces was palpable. They simply could not comprehend that this magnificent, multi-million-dollar empire was the sole creation of the daughter they had so viciously branded a failure. Swallowing whatever microscopic shred of pride they had left, they dragged their heavy feet up the wooden steps of my porch. Diane immediately broke down into loud, ugly, hysterical sobs. "Nevaeh, please," she wailed, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab my denim work shirt. "You have to help us. We have absolutely nothing left. The banks took the house. They took the accounts. Chloe is terrified in that federal holding cell, and we cannot afford the $5 million bail. You have to save your sister." Arthur stepped forward, attempting to muster a pathetic imitation of his former patriarchal authority. His voice shook violently. "You clearly have the assets now. If you sell this farm, or even just take out a massive loan against it, we can get her out. We can hire the right legal defense team to make this all go away. She is your blood, Nevaeh. You have to forgive her. That is what a family does. We sacrifice for each other." I did not flinch. I did not pull away from Diane's grasp. I simply looked at them with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying parasitic organism. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their manipulation hung heavily in the dry desert air. "Sacrifice?" I repeated quietly, my voice entirely devoid of any warmth or anger. "You want to talk about sacrifice?" I calmly turned, walked into the living room, and retrieved the heavy black leather binder I had compiled over the last 72 hours. It contained copies of the corporate wire transfers, the offshore routing numbers, and the transcribed recordings of the panicked Verdant executives currently hiding in my guest wing. I walked back out onto the porch and dropped the binder onto the solid oak table with a loud, resounding thud. "Open it," I commanded. Arthur hesitated, then reached out with shaking fingers to flip the cover open. Diane peered over his shoulder. I watched their eyes dart back and forth across the highlighted financial ledgers and the undeniable, irrefutable evidence linking their golden child to corporate destruction. "The startup you bankrupted yourselves to protect was a sophisticated money laundering operation," I explained, my tone sharp and clinical. "And her biggest client was the executive board of Verdant Horizon Innovations. The exact same people who deliberately tanked my department, stole my pension, and fired me to generate illegal capital. Chloe knew exactly where that dirty money was coming from. She happily washed it for them." Arthur's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly against the wooden railing. "That check," I continued, twisting the metaphorical knife with absolute precision, "the $150,000 you so proudly handed her at that dinner party, you unknowingly pulled that from a retirement fund that was heavily manipulated by the same shadow accounts. You took the stolen remains of my entire career, the very money that was supposed to secure my future, and you handed it directly to her on a silver platter to buy my label as a failure. You did not just favor her. You actively funded the destruction of my life." Diane let out a choked, horrifying gasp, collapsing heavily into one of the patio chairs. She buried her face in her trembling hands, rocking back and forth as the agonizing realization finally broke her mind. They had sacrificed everything they owned for a ruthless criminal who had gleefully fed on the corpse of their only honest child. Before the crushing silence could fully settle, the sharp, overwhelming stench of unleaded gasoline suddenly flooded the air. I whipped my head around toward the central greenhouse. Stepping out from behind a massive water silo was Chloe, She had not stayed in Chicago to face her federal court summons. She had illegally fled the jurisdiction, tracked her parents' rental car, and snuck onto my property like a cornered, rabid animal. She looked completely deranged. Her expensive designer clothes were torn and heavily covered in red dust. Her eyes were bloodshot, completely wild with a desperate manic energy. In her hands, she held a heavy red plastic jerry can, violently sloshing the toxic fuel all over the expensive reinforced glass and the delicate root systems of my rarest medicinal plants. "You think you won?" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking hysterically across the quiet farm. "You think you get to sit out here in your perfect little oasis while I go to prison? I am the winner. I have always been the winner." She aggressively unscrewed the cap of the jerry can and threw it into the dirt. She pulled a silver metal lighter from her pocket, her thumb resting dangerously over the spark wheel. "Sell the farm, Nevaeh!" she shrieked, splashing the remaining gasoline directly onto the wooden framework of the main entrance. "Call the bank right now and liquidate every single cent into my offshore account, or I swear I will burn this entire place to the ground. You will have to claim the insurance money anyway, and I will take that too. Do it, or I will destroy everything you love." Arthur and Diane simply screamed, frozen in absolute terror, entirely powerless to stop the monster they had created from striking the final, devastating match. Chloe's thumb pressed down hard on the jagged metal wheel of the lighter, desperately trying to strike the spark that would incinerate my entire life's work. But she never even got the chance. From the deep, impenetrable shadows of the supply shed, Julian launched himself forward with the terrifying speed of a coiled spring. He tackled her directly at the waistline, driving her violently into the soft, red dirt. The silver lighter flew from her trembling hand, skidding harmlessly away into the dark desert brush. I was there a fraction of a second later, grabbing her flailing wrists and pinning them firmly behind her back. The catastrophic threat of the fire was completely neutralized in a matter of seconds. Almost simultaneously, the deafening, piercing wail of police sirens ripped through the absolute silence of the Sedona night. A dizzying array of flashing red and blue lights flooded the long dirt road leading up to the farm, painting the glass greenhouses in frantic, chaotic colors. I had not just stood idly by when I realized exactly who my anonymous guests were 48 hours ago. The very moment I recognized those corrupt executives from Verdant Horizon Innovations, I made a very long, very detailed phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the state police. I gave them the exact coordinates of the fugitives they were actively hunting. Dozens of federal agents and state troopers swarmed the property with absolute precision. Chloe thrashed violently against the cold metal hood of a police cruiser, screaming horrific, incoherent curses into the night air. Her face was twisted in pure, unadulterated madness as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly and definitively around her wrists. She was shoved roughly into the back seat, still frantically shrieking that she was the absolute winner. A few yards away, Arthur and Diane completely collapsed. They dropped heavily to their knees on the coarse red sand, their ruined clothes covered in dirt, weeping uncontrollably. They looked incredibly small, entirely broken by their own massive, toxic failures, choking on the bitter ashes of the fraudulent pedestal they had dedicated their lives to building. As the armed officers prepared to load the remaining disgraced corporate executives from the guest wing into their armored transport vans, I walked slowly over to the boundary line of my farm where my parents still knelt in the dirt. They looked up at me with deeply tear-streaked faces, their eyes pleading. Perhaps they expected me to scream, to gloat, to finally unleash 28 years of violently suppressed rage. Instead, I looked down at them with a mind as perfectly still and quiet as a deep glass lake. "My greatest revenge," I told them, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the absolute weight of finality, "is that I no longer care about saving or destroying any of you." I turned my back on them and walked steadily toward the farmhouse, leaving them to drown in their own ruins. When the sun rose the next morning, casting a brilliant fiery glow over the jagged canyon walls. The farm was completely silent once again. I handed over the heavy black binder containing all the damning financial evidence and the secret recordings to the lead federal investigator. As the last official government vehicle kicked up a trail of dust down the driveway, the final, rotting remnants of my past were permanently swept away from my sacred land. I walked out into the very center of the amber oasis. Julian came up quietly behind me, wrapping his strong, calloused arms around my waist, resting his chin softly on my shoulder. We stood close together under the fierce, magnificent Arizona sun, smiling warmly as we looked out over the endless rows of vibrant, resilient medicinal flowers reaching proudly up from the hot sand. The dead, toxic earth had fully returned to life. The heavy, suffocating shadow I had lived under my entire life was completely gone. I was finally, truly free, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to look back ever again. Thank you so much to all of our amazing listeners for staying with me through this entire journey. I would love to know where you are listening from today, so please let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed today's story and found it meaningful, please consider helping us with just a $1 donation. You can scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the PayPal link in the description or comments below. Your generous support allows our channel to pay our incredible team so they can provide for their families and continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you, and take care.